Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. Today, we will highlight stories of Black Iowans seeking and celebrating equality dating from the first territorial Supreme Court case of 1839 to the more recent past. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came onto this webinar muted with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our presenter, State Curator Leo Landis. Leo has his Bachelor's of Science in History from Iowa State University and a Master's of Arts in Historical Administration from Eastern Illinois University. He has completed all but his dissertation towards a PhD in history from Iowa State. His museum experience includes time at Living History Farms in Urbandale, Conner Prairie, and Fishers, Indiana, and 8 years as curator at Henry Ford Museum and Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. He has also worked as a curator and director of education at Salisbury House in Des Moines. And now I'm very happy to turn over to Leo to begin the webinar.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you to all of you for joining us today, and also thank you to my colleague Matt Beyer behind the scenes who will help out with the conversation. So Jennifer gave you the general topic that we're going to talk about today. These are some stories that we've paid attention to at the State Historical Society of Iowa for a number of years. Many of them you may be familiar with, but I'm certain almost one of them you probably don't know, and that's the Mary Hamilton story that we'll get to late in the program. One of the two names that aren't on the list that normally we discuss when we're talking about Blacks seeking equality in Iowa are Susan Clark and Alexander Clark. We talked about that in our Back to School 101 a couple of years ago, so would encourage you to check that Iowa 101 topic out if you want to hear more about the Clark case of 1867, 1868. Certainly a major event in Iowa history to end legal segregation in our state. But I won't be talking about the Clarks today, but at least want to acknowledge that story before we get into the other stories. And as I said, these are all important stories about Iowans and stories that either have statewide or national import. And so as we are moving into June, and a week from Monday, June 12th is Monday, we're having a program here at the State Historical Building in the evening to kick off Juneteenth, but we'll also be celebrating statewide and nationally Juneteenth on June 19th, Monday. So stories of Black equality in Iowa. And let's begin with Ralph Montgomery, and then we'll go to Emma Koger. The next set from Gertrude Rush, George Woodson, S. Joe Brown, James B. Morris, are Iowans who were involved in the, and I realize I've taken out Charles Howard's name in there. So we'll talk about Charles Howard in that group. There are 5 Iowans who are founders of the National Bar Association. Then we'll move to Archie and Audra Alexander's story in Des Moines, Edna Griffin in Des Moines, but she's also a statewide advocate. And then Mary Hamilton, who born in Cedar Rapids, grew up in Des Moines, and then makes her name nationally. And many people especially Iowans, don't know her story. And then we'll wrap up talking about Roger and Arinda Maxwell. So most folks know, or many folks know, the sculpture that's just west of the Judicial Branch building, the Shattering Silence sculpture. And just so I don't forget to click, there's also one now in Dubuque. And this is the case that goes back to an enslaved man, or a man who'd been enslaved in Missouri, Ralph, and his enslaver was Jordan Montgomery. And Ralph, of course, wants his freedom. He's able to convince Mr. Montgomery to let him leave Missouri, come up to the lead mines of Dubuque in 1834, and try to earn enough money to gain his freedom, purchase his freedom. And when his contract is coming due in 1838, he hasn't made enough money. And so Jordan Montgomery sends slave catchers up to Dubuque in 1838 to try to retrieve what he views as his property and take Ralph back to Missouri. Well, people of Dubuque, Alexander Cartwright, I believe is one of them, is able to stop the effort to take Ralph back to Missouri. And a court case is filed by Jordan Montgomery, and so it's known as the case of Ralph. In 1839, trial is ruled, and we become a territory, of course, on July 4th, 1838. So we aren't the Iowa Territory when Ralph first comes to Iowa, but by 1838, July 4th, we are. And our very first Supreme Court case in Iowa Territory, 1 Iowa 1, is the case of Ralph. And our Chief Justice Mason, and I'll move to the next slide, showing from our state archives the brief ruling that is made by Justice Charles Mason. Always point out that he did finish ahead of Robert E. Lee in their class at West Point, is our territorial Chief Justice. So you see Charles Mason's name at the top of the document there, Chief Justice, and just going to say that Ralph, a man of color, cannot be legally enslaved in Iowa, and thus is a free man. And so in our state's history, dating back to territorial days, a Black man is ruled and advocating for his freedom, that he is not property, that he's a person, and that slavery can't exist in this territory of Iowa. That's based on the Northwest Ordinance. We weren't technically part of the Northwest Territory, but that had application to Iowa. That's part of what Chief Justice Mason uses, is saying, hey, the Northwest Ordinance bars enslavement in the northern states. And so Ralph is a free man. And just to point out, this makes national news in the 1839. So just a Vermont newspaper carries a story about the Supreme Court of Iowa, and it's it's essentially a wire story that comes out of St. Louis. So you see the New York Evening Post runs the St. Louis wire story saying that the first business session of the Supreme Court of the territory was held in Burlington the first week in July. The court decided that slavery was contrary to the laws of the territory, and that a slave taken there to work in the mines and permitted to hire his own time gained thereby a right to his freedom. So when you talk about important stories and a framework of United States history, the case of Ralph, 1 Iowa 1 from our territorial Supreme Court, is just so significant, and something that all Iowans can take pride in. But some of the stories that we'll share is, just because you're free doesn't mean you're equal. And so there are stories throughout our state's history that represent Blacks continuing to have, Black Iowans continuing to advocate for their own equality and equal treatment in our state's history. So be proud of the case of Ralph, but know that there's a rich and complex history to our state, and that's part of what we wanted to recognize, and we do recognize at the State Historical Society of Iowa that there are lots of stories out there. We're going to highlight just a few others. So this is a really important story to recognize as we're coming up on the 150th anniversary of the case actually having its ruling, but it was 151 years ago where the event takes place. And so the Northwestern Union Packet Company was a steamboat operating company on the Mississippi. It ran from St. Louis up to St. Paul, Minnesota, and had a number of ships that were plying the waters of the Mississippi. And Emma Coger was a teacher out of Quincy, Illinois, and wanted to make sure she was treated fairly as she was taking a steamboat trip up the Mississippi. And so you've got a Muscatine Evening Journal story from September 1872 that was from an early September event saying a great excitement occurred on the SS Merrill, the cause of which was a colored woman came on board and got a second-class ticket, and at dinner wanted a first-class meal ticket, which was refused. Well, what she had done was she had tried to purchase a meal ticket, was denied. She was a very light-skinned woman, but was regarded as Black, as was the custom in many cases, where if you had a grandparent or even one drop of African-American blood, you were often regarded as Black. And so she was denied that ticket. Well, she had a gentleman buy her a dinner ticket for first class to sit in the first class quarters as opposed to being in the galley. And so they tried to forcibly remove her. The way newspapers often would characterize this, and even the captain's testimony in the case, I've read the case, is, that she caused a disruption and wouldn't be removed and was causing lots of problems and just being disruptive. And so they wanted to take her out of the space because she was not by company policy allowed to be there. And so she files suit out of Iowa, even though she's from Illinois, and it could have been filed that way, knowing that Iowa might be a little more sympathetic, files her suit in Iowa. And just as an aside, you can see that segregating quarters is fairly typical in Iowa. So instance from the Alton, Illinois Telegraph referencing a hotel in Dubuque that is refusing to serve Black guests at a public table. So, it wasn't as if these steamships were unusual. It was pretty common to deny Blacks in certain areas across the nation and across Iowa equal accommodations or the same accommodations as whites. And so this is the beginning of Coger versus the Northwestern Union Steam Packet Company. And a packet is a term for a steamboat that's working. So if you ever encounter that term in the case or in reading about travel on the Mississippi, a packet is just another name for a steamboat. And so it does go to district court and then to the Iowa Supreme Court, with the final ruling actually coming down in September. So this September will be the 175th anniversary of that. 150th. Historians, I pride myself as a historian who can do math, not today apparently. So 150th anniversary this year of the Coger case. And you can see it goes through the district court, and that it's first heard in Keokuk, but also then when it goes to the Supreme Court, it's heard in Council Bluffs. And keep in mind, we don't have our big state capital in Des Moines yet in 1873. So the Iowa Supreme Court was meeting across the state as opposed to just meeting in Des Moines. So when the Coger case comes down in September 25th, 1873, from the Iowa Supreme Court, it rules with Justice Beck writing the opinion that a rule or custom of a steamboat as a common carrier requiring passengers of color to occupy a seat at a table in the pantry or on the guards of a boat is not responsible and cannot be enforced, and that a person of color is entitled to the same rights and privileges when traveling upon a steamboat as a white person and cannot be required by rule or custom based upon distinctions on accounts of race or color. And it does get played out then in 1884. Iowa creates a civil rights law. There had been a federal one that was in the works. It eventually was struck down, but Iowa has its own civil rights bill that comes through the legislature and is put in place in 1884 that gives additional protections to Blacks. But as we will talk about, it wasn't always enforced. And so the level of civil rights that Blacks have isn't really applied either in many instances from what happened in the Coger case or the Civil Rights Act of 1884. But again, here's a Black woman who will not tolerate being treated differently, and so it creates the basis for Iowa judicial ruling in 1873. So another important story to know. And as I said, 150th anniversary this September. We are looking to have a program later this month. So Sharon Woods, professor at University of Nebraska, Omaha, is going to go into good detail. She knows the Emma Coger story well. Even talked about it a little bit more than I intended to today, but come back in 2 weeks and should have a really great program. Or if you're watching a recording of this, track down Professor Sharon Wood's talk on the Coger case that will be presented on 2 weeks from today. So mention that Civil Rights Act of 1884 in Iowa. Another major event of Blacks advocating for equality and having state and national significance is the creation of the National Bar Association. And so, as I said, I left Charles Howard's name off that first screen. Apologies to the goddesses of history who may be watching and listening. So 5 people from Des Moines are part of the founders of the National Bar Association. And this is a group that's organized because the American Bar Association will not allow Blacks to join. And Charles Howard, he's pictured front row center there. Chose to use this picture from Alpha Phi Alpha, the Black fraternity's newsletter magazine called The Sphinx, and Iowa State University has a copy of it because as you look at the screen to the left of Howard, or to the right proper, is a young man named John G. Trice. That would be Jack Trice, who is who's come to Iowa from Ohio to go to Iowa State College in Ames, and will be playing football for Iowa State that fall. And so really delightful. There's a great blog post that this comes from, and Iowa State has a copy in special collections of the Sphinx magazine. So just a reminder of the role of these social groups that promote Black advocacy as well. And so Charles Howard is part of the Alpha Nu chapter in Des Moines of the men who had been part of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. So you've got Charles Howard, George Woodson, S. Joe Brown, Gertrude Rush, and James B. Morris as the 5 Iowa founders of the National Bar Association. And so we'll talk about each one of those people. Howard had been a long active lawyer in Des Moines, and moving to Gertrude Rush, her story is so compelling too. The first Black woman in Iowa to be admitted to the bar. Her husband had been a lawyer. She was born in Texas. They come to Des Moines and are living where he is practicing law. She starts studying law, takes some correspondence work and some other coursework, and then is admitted to the bar in the late teens. And she's an advocate for Black Iowans in central Iowa, and handles multiple cases, often involving women, so no shock there, and is a real compelling figure in our state's history. So long legal career, almost 45 years or so, and is part of that group who helps found the National Bar Association. And then you've got George Woodson, and he's the dean of this group, the oldest of the group, and first comes to the Osceola area in a coal mining community down around Muchokainik, and so is I meant to say Oskaloosa. If I didn't say Oskaloosa, that's what I meant for Muchokainik in Mahaska County. And so that's where he is based originally. He befriends S. Joe Brown, 10-year difference, and mentors Brown a little bit. And so they both are working out of Buxton, the Black coal mining community. They are taking cases in Wapello County and the Ottumwa area, all through the southeast third up to Des Moines, and eventually both do come to Des Moines. And so Woodson, just an incredibly important figure as a lawyer who's advocating for equality. And then S. Joe Brown, he and his wife Sue, they are also big advocates for Black equality. The Browns, especially with Sue Brown, looking for residences in Iowa City, or a residence in Iowa City where Black women can live as they're attending University of Iowa in the 19-teens and 1920s until the 1940s. Late 30s, early 40s, when University of Iowa finally allows Black women into residence halls with white students. And so the Browns are also an important story, with S. Joe Brown being the lawyer, but his wife Sue being equally important. And then James B. Morris, the youngest of this group on the screen, born in Georgia, goes to Howard University for his law degree, comes to Des Moines, and then serves in World War I, as did Howard, Charles Howard, as an officer trained in Des Moines at Fort Des Moines. And then, as we talk about Archie and Audra Alexander in just a bit, important in the Black community with the NAACP, the Browns, Gertrude Rush, George Woodson, James B. Morris, and Charles Howard are all founders of the Des Moines, or early members of the Des Moines NAACP, which was established in 1913. And again, most people know NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So the Black Equality, National Black Equality group. And so all five of these folks are early members and active in promoting Black equality. And as I said, both Morris and Howard are World War I officers in the segregated United States Army and trained at Fort Des Moines. So about the National Bar Association is Black men and women want to be part of a national organization of lawyers, again, denied membership in the American Bar Association. So meeting here in Des Moines in 1925, the National Bar Association is established with that group, Gertrude Rush, George Woodson, S. Joe Brown, James B. Morris, Charles Howard, Wendell Green, Francis Stratford, Jesse Baker, William Haynes, George Adams, Charles Calloway, Amasa Knox, in 1925 create the National Bar Association. And so if you're coming to Des Moines, a beautiful piece of public sculpture, much like Shattering Silence, by the Judicial Branch building. So if you enjoy public art, go visit Shattering Silence, just west of the Judicial Branch building, and then just north and west, so on Grand Avenue, about 8 blocks west of the State Historical Building is this intersection of 2nd Avenue and Grand Avenue. And there is the Monumental Journey public artwork to recognize the National Bar Association being founded in Des Moines. And so the National Bar Association still has a Gertrude Rush scholarship in honor of her and recognizes that group of 5 as well as the others as their founders. But its history does have its beginnings here in Des Moines. So having a group of lawyers advocating for Black equality and a professional Black organization, national professional Black organization, has its roots in Iowa. So another really important story. So the story of Archie and Audra Alexander. Archie is born in Wapello County. Audra, I believe, is from Nebraska by birth. And Archie's father moves to Des Moines in the late 1890s, early 1900s. Archie graduates from high school in Des Moines. He's from the near north side, up around what today is the Highland Park area. So a little farther north of downtown Des Moines is where he was growing up. And he enrolls in Highland Park College in that area. And while he is attending college, the college president bows to pressure from students from the American South, white students from the American South, who don't want to play sports, or don't want to attend college with Black students, let alone play sports with them. And Archie was a pretty fair football player, as you can see on the cartoon from the National Archives there on the left side of the screen. And so while he's at Highland Park College, he has to disenroll. 1905, I believe, is the year, 1906. Thereabouts. I could be off by a year or two. And so he transfers to University of Iowa and enrolls in engineering. And so becomes a nationally significant engineer. He does the power plant in Iowa City. He does the seawall of the Potomac near the Jefferson Memorial. So if you're in Washington, D.C., he had work done there. And again, one of those people who, kept advocating for himself. He would not back down. He did have a white partner who sometimes helped, but by the end, it was Archie Alexander doing most of his own work to gain contracts and make arguments. He eventually became the governor of the Virgin Islands. Well, in 1944, Archie and Audra are looking to buy a new home. That's James B. and Georgine Morris to the left in that photograph. Archie's the tallest man in the center, James B. Morris, and then Georgine Morris, and then Audra Alexander on the right holding the purse. They're looking to buy a new home, and they find a home in the Chautauqua Park area near Broadlawns Hospital here in Des Moines, just off Hickman Road. So lovely neighborhood. Well, in 1944, those houses in that neighborhood had restrictive covenants on them. A restrictive covenant being a clause written into the sale deed of the house saying they could not be sold to Black people. And that actually had been disallowed in Iowa by 1944, yet the neighbors, I think it's about 37 neighbors, join in a suit, 38, excuse me, because it's in the right column on the action being dropped. So it takes a year, and it takes Archie and Audra Alexander hiring James B. Morris as their lawyer to say, hey, restrictive covenants are not allowed in Iowa at this time, and yet white Iowans are trying to enforce that sort of, illegal and immoral clause in our state. So the Alexander's house is still at 2200 Chautauqua Parkway. It's a lovely little estate, and they didn't have any children live to adulthood, so they eventually sold it. It's not in their family any longer, but another case where a Black couple being denied housing, or an effort by whites to deny Blacks housing in a neighborhood in Des Moines, and a Black lawyer being their advocate for the case, and it took about a year for that to be settled, as you can see. Then, well known to Central Iowans is Edna Griffin. She had served in World War II in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the WACs. Her husband, Stanley, had come to Des Moines to study osteopathic medicine. So then the Des Moines Osteopathic College, today Des Moines University. And in the late 40s, Edna is a supporter of Iowan running for president, Henry A. Wallace, on the Progressive Party ticket. Wallace being a former Secretary of Agriculture, the son of a Secretary of Agriculture, and then a vice president in his own right, as well as Secretary of Agriculture and then Secretary of Commerce, but challenges the sitting president of his own party, Harry S. Truman, in 1948. And so at the same time that Henry A. Wallace is running for president on the Progressive Party ballot ticket, Edna Griffin is a supporter of him, and she and some friends, Leonard Hudson, John Bibbs, and another gentleman, decide to try to integrate the lunch counter at Katz Drugstore in Des Moines. And Katz was a Kansas City-based drugstore, but was at 7th and Walnut or 7th and Locust, excuse me, in Des Moines. The building's still there, now known as the Flynn Griffin Building or Griffin Flynn Building. And they are denied service, and so they file suit against Katz in the summer of 1948. It goes to last till 1949, actually, that initial lawsuit. And Charles P. Howard is representing them at the time. And again, the main plaintiffs are Mrs. Edna Griffin, John Bibbs, Leonard Hudson. There are some others involved, but they were the main activists. And so it starts a picket campaign, a major campaign through the late summer of 1948 with the lawsuits then as well. It actually leads to a conviction of the owner of, or the manager of Katz Drug, who was a member of the Katz family, and then also the waitress that was working there. There actually was a second case that was filed because after the first ruling, Katz Drugstore still refused to serve Blacks, even though they had been convicted of discrimination and violating the civil rights of Ms. Griffin and Bibbs and Hudson. And so they filed a second suit. It is also settled in the favor of Edna Griffin and the others. And so again, you think Iowa and you talk about cases like Emma Coger, and it's like, oh, Iowa is really ahead of many people in equal treatment of Blacks, and yet there are instance after instance. I didn't put the Tony case of Davenport, husband and wife couple in Davenport who were refused service at an ice cream parlor at about this time as well. So these are not, individual instances. So a case that I said that maybe not a lot of folks know. Before I leave Edna Griffin, we'll just talk about her one last second. Excuse me for jumping back. She's active across the state. There was a program 2 weeks ago or so that deeply involved Edna Griffin. And so if you want more about her, would encourage you to watch the I Felt If Things Didn't Change. And that's the short title for the Iowa History 101 program that ran on May 11th. I felt if things didn't change, the world would come to an end. Black Iowa Women Activism During the Civil Rights Era by Emily Bronswick. So really good content. One of the things that Emily talked about was Edna's activities across the state, and there is a sexual assault case of a Black man in the late 40s in Sioux City that she goes and is an advocate in presumed a forced confession in that case, a very complex and complicated case. There's an Annals of Iowa article about the case as well. And Tommy Lee Sims case, I believe, is the name. And so would encourage you to watch that Iowa 101 as well before I leave Edna Griffin. So Edna was advocating for fair treatment across the board, doing activities across the state, not just here in central Iowa. So as I said, Mary Hamilton's, this was a news story to me about a year and a half ago. And Mary Hamilton was born in Cedar Rapids, raised in Des Moines, from a Catholic family. I've done some background research on her. She lived on the northeast side of Des Moines as a girl, being raised by her grandparents eventually. And she is part of the Freedom Riders, as I said. And when she's in court, she sees the white Freedom Riders being called Miss, and as a Black woman, she's being referred to as Mary by the county attorney, and she starts refusing to answer and says, "You need to call me Miss Hamilton," and says, "My name is Miss Hamilton, please address me correctly." And when it comes up again, and she refuses to reply when she's not called Miss Hamilton, she is convicted of contempt. It's upheld by the Alabama Supreme Court in September of 1963. It then goes to the US Supreme Court, and in March 1964, because of Mary Hamilton's advocacy, the US Supreme Court says all people need to be treated respectfully and equally in a courtroom. And if you are going to refer to one person as Miss or Mr., you need to refer to everyone as Miss and Mr. So the Miss Mary case is the short version. It's March of 1964. That is a young Black woman. She actually graduated from high school in Denver, but it came back and attended Drake for a short time. So she does have deep Iowa roots, but then gets involved in the Freedom Rides of 1963. So again, just another story of an Iowan. And you know, sometimes in Iowa history, we, claim Glenn Miller because he was born in Clarinda, and so he is an Iowan by birth. Mary Hamilton, Iowan by birth, and long upbringing in the state. So really compelling and important story on a Black woman advocating for equality and equal treatment, who's got a often overlooked role in our state and national history because it takes place in Alabama, and she had moved out of state by the time she's doing her Freedom Rides. And so want to wrap up with a story of two people who are still alive. Ms. Hamilton is now deceased, but both Roger and Arinda, her nickname is Bunny. I know Roger a bit from conversations about his career and his work as a teacher. And he grows up in Marshalltown in 1967. As he's changing jobs and taking a job in Des Moines, he writes a opinion piece for the Des Moines Tribune, the afternoon paper, called "The Painful Experiences of a Negro in Iowa," and just walks through what hit some of the instances in his life. So as a teenager playing American Legion baseball, being called the N-word repeatedly on the baseball diamond in Iowa in the 1940s. And then as he is at University of Northern Iowa, then Iowa State Teachers College, playing in a band, because Roger was a music major and going into education as a music teacher, is being either denied admission to clubs in the Black Hawk County area, even though he's, with a white group of friends. He is barred from service at restaurants and clubs in Northeast Iowa, and then serves in the Coast Guard in Hawaii after graduating, comes back to Iowa, starts interviewing for jobs as an educator. He and Bunny are married, will always tell the principal or the superintendent when he's interviewing for a job that, just so you know, it's going to be a Black man who shows up for the interview in the 1950s and early 1960s. And so is often, then told, thank you for letting us know. And the interview may be just a kind of performative instance, but did speak highly, and I've spoken to him about this, of the principal who hired him in Brooklyn at what is today BGM High School. So East Central Iowa, Eastern Iowa, just along I-80 area. And he has students who don't have a lot of training in reading music or music performance, so creates a set of booklets called 14 Weeks to a Better Band that is still in publication, that is for elementary and high school students on how to perform without being totally able to read music. And so we've got copies of that booklet for the senior high edition in our libraries here in Des Moines now, and in the museum collection here in Des Moines. But Roger talks about when he and Arinda moved to Des Moines in 1967. They're only being shown houses in certain neighborhoods. So even though people like the Alexanders were able to buy the house in Chautauqua Park, there isn't the opportunity for Blacks in Des Moines and other communities. And I think of the story of the Harrises, which we've done a great video on through our State Historic Preservation Office. If you just do an internet search for Harris, Cedar Rapids, Iowa history house, I think you'll get a really nice video of the Harris children talking about their experience in Cedar Rapids, where Methodist Church in Cedar Rapids sells a lot for a home to their parents because of the difficulty they were having in Cedar Rapids in finding housing. So it's not, it's across our state where in the 1960s, 1970s, Black Iowans aren't treated equally. The Des Moines Register had done a series in 1964 of a Black couple trying to rent apartments, a white couple then following on their heels, and the Black couple being denied, and then the white couple being said, oh, sure, we've got a apartment to rent. So the experiences of the Maxwells, which happened in my lifetime, that apartment case, or the Harrises shortly before my lifetime, but possibly for some of you listening in, Blacks finding housing has been a struggle in our state's history, and neighborhoods where they would choose. Roger also talks about, even in the 1960s, attending a professional conference in a larger city in Iowa, and when he shows up at the hotel desk, said, we don't have a room for you. And then when his principal or superintendent arrives and said, well, he booked the room for me, he and his superintendent are told neither of them have rooms. So really challenges all across the board. And yet Roger and Bunny create the book. As I said, it becomes an important training manual still in print from an Iowa publisher. Actually, the Barnhouse Publishing down in Oskaloosa is the publisher of it. So still available. And they eventually moved to Windsor Heights, so a western suburb of West Des Moines, and talking to their daughter, Courtney, understand that they're looking to move out of that house, but finally weren't denied finding a home where they were treated equally later in their lives. But in the 1960s, certainly that was the case. And so with that, we've got about 15 minutes left. Would encourage you again to tune in 2 weeks to hear Dr. Sharon Woods talking about the Cozier case. But with that, we'll turn it over to my colleague, Matt.
Well, thank you, Leo. We, like you said, have time for some questions. If you have a question, please submit those through the Q&A feature right here on Zoom. But let's dig in. So we have a little time at the end of the hour. And I know before we started today, you were mentioning some people and stories you wished you could have spoken about. Do you want to mention any of those? Any people you wish you could include in the talk today?
You know, just because of the importance of the Clark case, you know, that's incredibly significant. And both first the Black soldiers of Iowa serving in the 1st Colored Regiment of Iowa, and that group of over 1,000 men, they're not all Iowans, but here's a group of men who in 1863, once the Emancipation Proclamation is issued in Iowa, or nationally on January 1st, 1863, part of that also then allows blacks, it changes the policy, and black men are allowed to serve. And so we do have the, what they call themselves, the 1st Black Regiment of Iowa. Some of those men are killed in service. A number of them die in service from disease. They're in pretty rough conditions down in Arkansas when they're actively serving. It's the Black women of Muscatine and Keokuk who are part of that support group who sew their flag for them. So if you are able to get to the State Historical Building of Iowa, we are currently open Tuesday through Friday, 9 to 4:30, and that flag, at least the remnants of it as it's been stabilized and conserved, is currently on display in the Historical Building in our Iowa 175 exhibit, Iowa's People and Places. So that story is certainly one that we've talked about at different times and are important Iowa history stories to emphasize. And then on the heels of that is the constitutional change of 1868 that strikes the word white from the Iowa Constitution. Alexander Clark is an important figure in that effort as well. And, you know, we did the program last year on Iowa Juneteenth and emancipation celebrations. That's the thing to keep in mind, too, is Juneteenth has been a state holiday since 2002 in Iowa. But going back to before the Civil War, Alexander Clark and others in Muscatine are celebrating and pushing for Black equality and emancipation, and celebrating Emancipation Days in Muscatine pre-1860. So 1856, 1857 events are taking place, and then through the late 1860s, events all across our state in more than 35 communities, Blacks celebrating emancipation and equality and freedom. So many stories that are out there in smaller communities across the state too, connected to, you know, Alexander Clark's a well-known name. There are Black Iowans in places like Mechanicsville, in Cedar County, in Page County in Southwest Iowa, or Taylor County in Southwest Iowa, or Decatur County. You know, it could just keep listing off all the advocacy from Black Iowans to have integrated celebrations around freedom and equality in our state. And so you've got those events too that, not naming specific names, but events where Blacks were honoring and celebrating emancipation and equality into the 1940s, 1950s. So you've got those stories. And as I said, the Tonys of, I think I've got the last name right, and there's a good Annals of Iowa article on them as well. We'll make sure Jennifer has that, or you have that, Matt, in the resources to send out if people want to learn more about their advocacy in Scott County. So really important stories all across our state. Things like Freeman, and I'm blanking, I think it's Lucille Freeman, the first Black teacher in Sioux City, or Harriet Curley, the first Black teacher in the post World War II era in Des Moines. Part of that advocacy saying Black students deserve, first, Black teachers deserve to be treated equally and interviewed fairly. And so Harriet Curley is one of the earliest out of Des Moines at Perkins Elementary, but just being up in Sioux City was reminded, and I think it's Lucille Freeman. I know Freeman is the last name. Wish I had snapped a photo of the little bust that they have of her outside the city building to have included that story today too.
Well, as a historian, I'm talking about kind of the story of civil rights in Iowa. How do you view the evolution of civil rights in Iowa compared to the nation as a whole?
Both nationally and in Iowa, it's always complex. And, you look at our first state constitution and even the territorial laws, we had Black codes in Iowa. There were communities, that would surprise you, like Manly, Iowa had a pretty thriving Black community in Northeast Iowa for a number of years. And then another story that, I could have brought in was Amos versus Prom, which is the last major civil rights case on race in Iowa. And that's LaFawn Amos and her husband of Mason City in the 1950s, late 40s, early 50s, want to see a concert at Surf Ballroom, and they are denied entry because the Prom company that owned the Surf at the time was banning Blacks from attending shows. And so, lots of encouraging stories, but lots of stories too where Blacks have faced challenges. So much like I said, you had the 1884 Civil Rights Bill passed in our state. So very early, very commendable by the Republican legislature of the state at the time to pass that and have the bill signed by the governor. And yet it's not enforced very actively even into the early 1920s and obviously till the 1940s, because Edna Griffin is having to advocate. And I, talked about now Amos versus Prom. You've got people like Cecil Reed, who ended up being a legislator on the Republican side. He and his wife open a motel in Cedar Rapids late mid-50s, I believe, called the Sepia Motel, because Blacks traveling on Highway 30, maybe from Chicago to Omaha or Chicago to Denver, might have a hard time finding a room. And so they open a little hotel for a few years along Highway 30. So complex things to be encouraged about from the state of Iowa, but also, enough stories out there to know that equality wasn't always guaranteed for Black Iowans.
A question came in from someone from the African American Museum of Iowa, and their question was, what do you think is the biggest myth about Black Iowan history?
Oh, that it's not Iowa history would be part of it. That it's like a niche story, and it's like, like the good work that they do at African American Museum of Iowa. These are Iowa history stories. And to really understand Iowa history and United States history, you need to look at the breadth of the stories, the experiences of Iowans of lots of different backgrounds to get the full complexity of the history of our state and nation. And so if you wanted something a little different than that response, but that to me is what it is. I think there's a bit of a myth because we've had so many important, encouraging decisions that, Iowa was different. And you can say, yes, by the court cases we were, but by the experiences of Black Iowans, there are too many to say it wasn't that much different. It was better than maybe being in Alabama, but there was still unequal treatment for Blacks across our state. In many instances, not by everyone. There are lots of great folks, but there was enough challenges, as I think we've talked about today, that showed the struggle's not done.
Mm-hmm. Another question from our audience today. An attendee who has never understood why and is trying to understand the historical construct asked what arguments you have found in your research were used in Iowa for the subjugation of the Black community. Did you find anything in your research about that?
There's the inherent prejudice. I mean, in the Clark case, you see, newspapers in 1868, talking about how this is going to lead to race mixing. And so, I think it's a challenge to understand the past, but even some of the instances of people who are racist today, of how could you feel that way? And so when you hopefully are raised to try to see each other equally, and yet know that there may be some part of your upbringing where if somebody looks different than you, you may treat them differently, no matter how you're raised, it can be a struggle. And so I think if you look at things like the fact that, Blacks and women weren't allowed to vote in our first state constitution. Obviously, we had racist and sexist laws in our first state constitution, and that was based on an idea of, men are superior to women in decision making, and so why would you want to let women vote? And that whites are superior, white men are superior, so they're the only ones who can vote. Black men can't vote in that first constitution in 1857. Clark challenges that, and it's voted down. So those legacies that go back to our earliest days in history, you could ask yourself, when does racism end in Iowa? I'm still looking, at least from some individuals, when that ends. Give me a date.
Well, our last question today will focus on, I think, our favorite thing of research that I like to do. Our question comes, what are some resources you'd recommend for research on Black Iowans in history?
Yeah, so African American Museum of Iowa has some great content online. Our Annals of Iowa, edited by my colleague, Dr. Andrew Klump, that's all been digitized, and so some good stories there. Even the Goldfinch, which is a children's magazine that we use to publish, has good information. The effort done in early 2000s, I think publication date was 2000, 2001, of Outside In, the African American experience in Iowa, just a really great resource there. Most public libraries in the state have that document, that book, I should say. So if you just kind of want to browse some topics and get a sense, Rochelle Chase has done some really good work on Buxton recently that's interesting history. But Dorothy Schweter, the Dean of Iowa Historians, the late Dr. Dorothy Schweter, she did some work on Buxton as well. We have the oral histories that she and some others conducted of the both white and Black residents of Buxton. So we've got some great resources. And then working on a project between Iowa State, African American Museum of Iowa, and State Historical Society of Iowa. And I know I'm leaving out some partners, but should be having some primary source material out there. I'm just about done with this answer, Matt, because it's 12:58. So the project, the project that the State Historical Society of Iowa did with the Library of Congress was to digitize the Iowa State Bystander through 1921. So currently you can browse the Black newspaper, the main Black newspaper of Iowa. There were some other papers that came and went or are still around as well. Some good publications out there. Excuse me, Black Iowa News with Dana James doing some good work today. But wrapping that part up, so chronicling America, and I know Jennifer and I will make sure this is in the resources, or the three of us will, to be able to search the Iowa State Bystander and just get a sense of some of those stories of the Black experience in our state in that 1894 to 1920 period, as you're getting the out-migration from the South and the people coming to our state looking to make a better life. And that's what I think Iowa history, really, to wrap up, is all about, is, how can we make our state the best state to live, best place, a good place to live, and that everyone has equal opportunity. And that's some of the stories that we shared today.
And that's a great way to end this today. Thank you, Leo. And with that answer, we'll bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And I want to extend one last thank you to presenter Leo. It's always great to have you join us on here. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months, and we're excited to share them. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series, or to watch past recordings, you can check out our website, iowaculture.gov. And while you're there, you can look into other fantastic programs we have, such as our Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians. We look forward to virtually seeing you here again for our next Iowa History 101 webinar on June 22nd. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.